On the show today, we'll focus on Nigeria's trade strategy, and we'll ask the question, how should Africa's largest economy position itself regionally and internationally? As always, you can join the conversation with the hashtag that's Beyond Market. You can follow my Twitter handle too at Esther Ubudaga. Now, Nigeria's recent decision to opt out of the Africa Continental Free Trade Area came as a shock to many. The government says it's carrying out wider consultations to ensure the country gets a favourable deal out of the pact. So how should Nigeria position itself both regionally and internationally to get the best of both worlds? Jonathan Aremu, Professor of International Economic Relations at the Covenant University. He also leads the trade group of the Nigeria Economic Summit Group. He joins me from Abuja for this discussion. Thank you, Professor, for taking the time out to join us today.
Thank you.
It's been quite a controversial conversation so far. The Continental Free Trade Agreement, that's on one hand. There's also the Economic Partnership Agreement. But let's start with the Continental Free Trade Agreement. We know that several African countries have signed on. Nigeria almost signed on to it, but at the last minute, President Buhari pulled out and says he needs to embark on wider consultations to ensure that Nigeria gets a very good deal out of it. But let's start with you sharing your perspective on the merits or the benefits of the Continental Free Trade Agreement and what it seeks to achieve as a whole.
Thank you, viewers, and thank you from the headquarters of CNBC. Let me just correct one impression. Nigeria has not opted out from the African Economic Community integration process because I heard you saying that Nigeria opted out. That is not true. Nigeria has always supported economic integration at regional level as well as at continental level. You will recall that when this process of CFTA started, it started with Lagos Plan of Action 1980 to 1982, of which, the title of it was Legal Plan of Action for the entire continent. And then when it becomes the African Economic Community, it was titled Abuja Treaty of 1991. So Nigeria has always been at the forefront of it. And when you look at it, even the CFTA itself, the chief negotiator is Nigerian. It's a Nigerian. Ambassador Chiedu Osako is a Nigerian. So Nigeria participated nearly in all the processes. But on the 4th of July 2017, all the heads of state agreed that member state governments should go and sensitize, have adequate consultation with their members in the country so that they can buy the idea and then so that it can be easy for implementation. And that is exactly what the head of state of Nigeria thought he has not done. And then try to converse to the entire Africa. I think that is good enough. To the benefit of African Continental Free Trade Area, we already know that, clearly speaking, from theory to practical, is going to enhance greater level of trade within the entire continent, and by actually diverting our attention to trading more among ourselves than actually trading with other parts of the world. Because the basic theory behind economic integration, advantage trade diversion and trade creation. Trade creation among participating countries and diverting from the outside world. So we actually buy that idea. Nigeria is in love with it. Nigeria participated in it. And we believe that it's going to actually enhance Nigeria's integration into the continent trading environment better. So briefly speaking, that is what I can say for that now.
Now, still on the benefits, according to the United Nations Economic Commission for Africa, of course, we know that Africa has this CFA, when it does get into a full swing, it will bring 1.2 billion Africans together with a combined GDP of more than 2 trillion. But there are also talks about the fact that there could be in the short term some challenges, especially from what I've heard, that the treasury of many of the African countries that will sign up to it, there might be a loss from their treasuries. But in the long term, if it works out, if all pans out, we could actually see the GDPs of the members who have signed on growing significantly. What are your thoughts on that?
That is just a fact of theory and practice. At the beginning of it, there's going to be some adjusting mechanisms to be able to actually adjust the trade relation between Africa countries with the rest of the world as a result of the economic integration. That is as a result of coming into operation of the Continental Free Trade Area. But as time goes on, clearly speaking, it's going to actually lead to an expansion of economic activities among member states in the entire continent, and it's going to lead to what I called earlier on trade creation among member states, and quite a lot of trading which we have been doing with the outside world will now actually be with ourselves, and that is expected to actually boost the GDP of the member state. Why? Because we shall be able to actually operate on greater economies of scale. Quite a lot of the global market, which we have not been able to penetrate. It's going to be easier to penetrate the continental market easier than the global market, of which there are quite a lot of other non-tariff barriers that have not been allowing an African product to enjoy global recognition. So clearly speaking, that then the Economic Commission for African report is welcome. It's something we expected. In fact, not only that, African member states can actually have increasing GDP more than what they have actually targeted when the CFTA come into full swing in the long run.
Now, at the heart of this agreement is the fact that countries will have to remove tariffs on 90% of all goods and 10% of some sensitive goods. But critics of this agreement say that the CFTA focuses more on cutting these tariffs and not without sufficient consideration of the varying production capabilities of African countries, especially the smaller African countries. What are your thoughts on that?
I mean, you are partially correct also. Just to go back to Article 24 of the World Trade Organization, GATS, you know, when countries are going into economic integration, either in terms of free trade area or custom union, the issue of trading among yourselves should be substantial so that it will not affect other member nations of the WTO. So, I mean, and to say that 90% of our product will actually be among ourselves, and then the rest 10% will be allowed by member state countries to hold. I think that's a welcome idea, and that is expected. Though quite a lot of countries may not be able to initially be able to want that kind of openness to happen. But seriously speaking, I think it is not a bad deal. It's something that was negotiated among member states of the entire continent, and no country actually said no to the 90% or how they arrive at the 90%. So it was what was negotiated. And even when you look at the EPA, which you say you are going to actually talk about later, we have higher percentage also, but not as high as that one, because the level of economic development among member states with respect to EU and ACP is not the same as that of African nations.
Okay.
Quite a lot of African nations we are more or less on the more or less homogeneous economic development level, and that one allows us to be able to open more among ourselves than with developed countries.
Okay, now, Professor, still on the CFTA, I mean, it was in this same spirit that the European Union was formed, which included the UK, and they created a single market. There was free movement of goods and people across borders. The borders were removed, but that appeared to have lasted or worked for a while. But then, of course, challenges cracks began to appear. We saw the likes of Greece going bankrupt. We saw smaller Eastern European countries going into difficult economic turbulence, and then we saw the bigger European economies having to financially bail out those countries. Now, everybody, of course, had to take a step back, especially the UK. And, of course, we know that is what led to Brexit, the UK leaving that union. Of course, there was talk also about jobs being lost to foreigners because, of course, there were no borders anymore. So many people who are looking at the CFTA are also saying that how do we make sure that we do not fall into that same trap that the EU fell into, where bigger economies had to bail out consistently smaller economies who had run into trouble, whose budgets were not subject to scrutiny, as it were, the likes of Greece. So how do we make sure that we don't fall into that same trap?
That's an excellent question, and then that appeared to have answered the question why Nigeria actually said that they want to engage in greater consultation. When you look at Nigeria, that's the greatest economy in Africa, and as much as possible, if the head of state, President Muhammadu Buhari, thought that as the biggest economy in Africa, let us actually look at home and have greater consultation so that we don't enter and then come back just the way you said that it's happening in Europe. Look at NAFTA also, that is the North American free trade area between Mexico, USA, and Canada. It's having some issues. And that's exactly the problem that we did not want to engage in terms of Nigeria. But let me say this one. Under international treaty negotiation, there is one principle they call pacta sunt servanda. What is pacta sunt servanda? It is whatever you agree must be obeyed. Whatever you agree, you have to abide by it. Nigeria being aware that whatever we are going to agree, we have to abide by it, want to actually make sure there is greater consultation. So what I'm saying is that just as Nigerian did, because all the countries that have signed on to this thing, they have to go back to their domestic government to be able to ratify. During the time of, before the time of ratification, and this time, they need to pay attention to what they need to do so that the whole process will come out with something that they can easily implement, so that the integration will not just be on paper, and then it will not lead to what you have, the examples you have been able to see in which Greece was having problem, and Germany and France have to have a lot of bailout strategies to see the countries that are...
Okay, Professor, for us, for Nigeria, as we take a step back to engage in wider consultations, what exactly, at what point are we going to say, okay, we're okay and we can now sign this agreement? What do we need to do back home here to get us to that place where we're comfortable enough to sign that agreement?
Oh, thank you. That's a very good question also. Let me tell you and assure you that right now, the president is so much committed to this process. He has set up a committee under his own supervision to be able to monitor the issue of the CFTA, because this has been a program that in which Nigeria committed itself a lot. And therefore, they are looking into it. I'm aware that sensation will commence before the end of this month. I'm equally aware that quite a lot of governmental institutions are planning how to be able to give substantial consultation and discussion among the stakeholders that have one concern or the other with the various provisions within the CFTA document. But what is there is that as much as possible, I may not be able to give you the timeline, but the rest assured. You see, it doesn't have a closing date. This is the entire continent, and we are still part of the continent. So, and even WTO itself, I mean, when you look at it, Liberia did not become member of WTO until 2015. So, once you actually have enough consultation at the home base, and people are now comfortable, Nigeria will be very much eager. The economy is big enough, we are going to have access to the large market of Africa, which is going to be a lot of benefit for Nigeria. But without consultation, I don't think it is good to go ahead. And Nigeria actually done right. The issue is this again. Why have there not been consultation? The time between the negotiations that started in February last year to the conclusion in December was rather too short. You discover there are so many meetings. 4 meetings of the technical working group were held, and after this meeting were held, the African ministers of trade, they equally met by December last year to be able to ratify and then put it on tools of the head of state to actually conclude the whole thing. There were not enough time to have been able to look at this thing and sensitize the various stakeholders that needs to know something about it. So the timing is going to come. I'm thinking that maybe before the end of this year, that's just my own opinion, but I think that quite a lot of progress is being made.
All right, Professor, we need to take a short break. Stay with us. We'll come back and pick up from where we left off. I've been speaking to Jonathan Aremu, Professor of International Economic Relations at the Covenant University. He also leads the trade group of the Nigeria Economic Summit Group. We'll continue our discussion right after the break. Don't go anywhere. Professor Jonathan Aremu still with us. We're looking at Nigeria's international trade relations now and in the future. Professor, thank you for your time so far.
I'm okay, my sister.
Now, some of the conversations that President Buhari will be having will be with the Nigeria Labour Congress and, of course, the Manufacturers Association of Nigeria. And I get a sense that some of those conversations may be difficult for the president and his economic team, especially since the Nigeria Labour Congress has been very vocal about their about the CFTA, and they've even described this as extremely dangerous. What is your perspective?
Yeah, I don't think that it's going to be difficult or dangerous the way NLC classify it. You see, that kind of language is coming from NLC because of lack of consultation. And it's just because of that that they now express it that way. So I don't think that the consultation will be a difficult thing. From that of Nigerian Manufacturers Association of Nigeria, that also will not be anything difficult. Why? Because they have passed through this terrain before during the EPA negotiation. It's a matter of actually comparing notes with that of EPA and then ensuring that they have to actually dot the I's and cross the T's. So I believe that it's not going to be a difficult process. Secondly, the government put up a committee already that will sensitize the entire nation with respect to this issue of the CFTA. So we are going to come out of it very soon, and it's going to be fine for the entire country.
Okay, now another issue that has been raised is the issue of competitiveness, especially for local industries here in Nigeria who operate in a high interest rate environment and have difficulty many times with accessing cheap affordable credit. Now, many of the companies or many of the industries, some outside of Nigeria, don't have a difficult time like the manufacturers here. They have cheaper lines, access to cheaper lines of credit, and produce goods at cheap with cheap credit. So I'm thinking, how will Nigerian goods be or compete with those goods when they come into our market?
Well, thank you for that question again, but let me say this, that with liberalization, with economic integration coming up under the CFTA, there's going to be what we call in economics of scale in terms of production. And economies of scale will not only affect manufacturing companies alone, it will equally be reflected in opportunity for the financial sector to be able to have more customers. And then with increasing customers, with increasing economies of scale, the various segments of our national economy will have a cost reduction in their operation. And let me say this one, if Nigerian banking system is cost prohibitive, why do we have quite a lot of Nigerian banks in West Africa? Why do we have them in other parts of African countries? I think that our banking system is not prohibitive, that will be a danger to the manufacturing or the economic sectors in terms of production. I think, well, even apart from this one, the Central Bank of Nigeria is equally going to be involved in the sensitization, and then they'll be able to really know what to do in terms of making sure that the monetary policy is farmed in a way that will allow the manufacturing sector not to operate under the tight condition which you are saying. Well, let me say this one, that most of the time the cost of funds that go to the economic sector, they are based on supply and demand. You cannot, if the supply is available, then the price will actually fall if it's more than the demand. So if the cost of credit is a result of the supply and demand, then I'm saying the equilibrium price of interest rate that is available in the market is a result of the relative supply and the demand equation. Then with economies of scale, we are definitely going to have a very better time in terms of reduction in costs.
Now, Professor, let's move on to the Economic Partnership Agreement. Now, this has been in the works for a very long time. Conversations have gone back and forth. The EU, yes, along with ECOWAS, have impressed on Nigeria, the government, to sign this agreement, but Nigeria says it has declined so far and says it is still embarking on wider consultations. And I'd like to read a statement put out by the presidency some time ago on this issue, and it reads that presently our industries cannot compete with the more efficient and highly technologically driven industries in Europe. I'm just thinking that also, takes us back to the point I made earlier about the issue of competitiveness. So if this is where we are and consultations are happening, I'm just thinking it goes beyond consultations. Structural changes also have to be done hand in hand with those consultations for us to, get, better benefits from this EPA. But what are your thoughts?
On the EPA issue, it's a different game entirely. Yeah, why do I say it's a different game? It's more or less an economic integration between David and Goliath. One is a giant, the other one is a dwarf. And then as much as possible, such an economic integration, we have to be a little bit clear in the way the thing we have to come up. When you look at the design of the EPA, it wasn't actually made to be able to be development-driven, particularly for us in Nigeria. Number one, when the It was drafted before the negotiation. It was drafted by European Union with no input from us. So we were actually negotiating from something which they have drafted. Well, it's not only Nigeria, it's the entire African, Caribbean, Pacific, made up of about 77 countries. But in the ECOWAS model of kind of integration, we don't have any input to the initial draft that was put on the scale. Well, after the draft of the EPA, the thematic group that was set up, I served on the investment part of it, and then I discovered that the investment cannot actually be put on the EPA now, and that is why the investment was removed. So also trading services was removed. So it was only trading in goods. Even with the trading in goods also, when you look at the decision of EU with respect to it, and then you look at the configuration of the ECOWAS country along the line of least developed and developing countries, you will discover that we are grouped together as if the economic development level of the 50 member states are the same. It's not true. Nigerian economy is called developing economies. That of the around 11 other countries are least developed countries. And then to say that all of us will have to actually negotiate this under the same kind of an arrangement, I think that is not a good enough arrangement. Again, not only that, the least developed components of ECOWAS member states will continue to enjoy the Lomé 4 until we finalize the agreement, which equally is a divisive kind of tendency.
So are we making progress? Sorry to butt in, Professor. Are we making progress with tweaking it to ensure that it's mutually favorable to us too?
Yeah, it is favorable. I think both Nigerian government as well as ECOWAS Commission, they are consulting and then taking on board quite a lot of the concern from Nigeria. Number one, the EPA in its present form will not be able to be beneficial to Nigerian economy. I agree with that one. Right from the beginning of this discussion on EPA, that was my own position as well. So I think we are making progress. But I don't think Nigeria can actually sign on to it now. Why?
So is there a timeline? Do we know when we'll be able to iron out or hash out the details?
I don't have the timeline. Let me say this one, that a timeline will have been initially drawn if, let's say, we have an ECOWAS trade policy. We don't have an ECOWAS trade policy now. And therefore, Nigeria actually putting himself on an EPA without a regional policy that will have accommodated this thing. It's not fair. Let us finalize the ECOWAS trade policy and agree first. And then when we agree on it, we now look at the position of the EPA inside the ECOWAS trade policy. And then not only that, Nigerian concern, we now again look at it and then address it quite well to ensure that the EPA will not split the entire ECOWAS economies. But the way it is, if it's implemented, our economic integration in ECOWAS will actually be dismantled. And we are not going to enjoy the same thing we're enjoying among ourselves again. Why? Because even as from January 1st, 2008, you will discover that both Ghana and Cote d'Ivoire, they signed the interim aspect of the EPA, leaving Nigeria alone. Because Nigeria is the third country that is a developing country. So, which is more or less a divisive tendency. It shouldn't be like that. Okay. If you believe the whole thing is good for all of us, then let all of us agree. And as I used to say, SADC kind of an EPA, South Africa was given a special preference before they concluded their own EPA. Why can Nigeria not be given a special preference, being the leading economy in West Africa, before we conclude it?
Okay, Professor, we're going to have to move on. Now, while all of that is still going on, I know that the EU and, of course, the UK are also embarking on trade missions. They're also negotiating trade deals with countries here in Africa. Nigeria is one of them. I know that, of course, the UK, the Brexit negotiations are still on, but, of course, Nigeria still needs to know what its position is in terms of trade with both sides. That's the EU on one hand and the UK. So how is Nigeria approaching its trade relations now with the UK on one hand and the EU as a bloc?
Well, you see, our president is currently in UK. I think it's a very timely thing. And then, you see, these are this kind of a thing that's been coming up. I don't know the content of their discussion. But because Nigeria has not actually signed on to the EPA, despite the fact that the rest of the 13 or 14 members signed on to it, when you combine Mauritania, I think that Nigeria is part of the thing which the president of the country may actually discuss with UK. But again, as much as possible, I believe strongly that we shouldn't allow the EU decision on the EPA to split the ECOWAS community. The entire ECOWAS community should still operate as one. And secondly is the fact that quite a lot of other, with this CFTA thing, let us conclude the CFTA before concluding the EPA. I believe in sequencing all these trade agreements. Let us perfect the regional one before we go into continental one. After the continental one, we can now go into the international one, which is the EPA. Because if we are not very careful, the way the EPA is configured, dividing Africa into 4, and then having the other 2 kind of region outside Africa, and then having a separate negotiation. If we are not very careful, it's going to equally be a disturbing factor for the implementation of the CFTA. So let us finish the CFTA issue, and then we can now go back to the EPA. That means we will have sequenced the agreement and the negotiation. It will be better that way.
Okay.
I think we are making progress.
Professor, I'm going to have to thank you very much for your time today.
You.
We appreciate your time on the program. Thank you for talking to us, Jonathan Aremu, Professor of International Economic Relations at the Covenant University. He also leads the trade group of the Nigeria Economic Summit Group.